This public hearing for the Joint Standing Committee on the National Broadband Network. This hearing is being held via teleconference and in person and by video. We're joined today by Deputy Chair Ms Templeman, Dr Haynes, Senators Antic and Farrell. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. The hearing is also being broadcast via the Australian Parliament House website. I remind witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also contempt to give false or misleading evidence to the committee. The committee generally prefers evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such request, of course, may be made at any other time. A witness called to answer a question for the first time should state their full name and the capacity in which they appear, and witnesses should speak clearly to assist Hansard to record proceedings. I ask that all committee members and witnesses mute their microphones unless given the call to speak, to ensure that all questions and responses can be heard clearly. If members experience connection problems during the hearing, please contact Secretariat directly through the WhatsApp group. To assist Hansard, I remind all speakers to state their name prior to speaking. With the formalities over, I welcome representatives from the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman. I thank you for taking the time to give evidence today. I understand the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, I'd ask you to state your full name and the capacity in which you appear today.
Thank you. My name is Judy Jones and I am the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Michael Lavarch, and I'm the Chair of the TIO Board.
Thank you, Mr Chair. My name is Gillian Brewer. I'm the Assistant Ombudsman, Dispute Resolution.
Thank you. I now invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation for the Joint Standing Committee. I'm pleased to be here and to share any insights I can. As in the introductions, I'm assisted by the Chair of our Board, Professor the Honourable Michael Lavarch, and Ms Gillian Brewer, Assistant Ombudsman, Dispute Resolution. The TIO is the external independent dispute resolution scheme for Australia's telecommunications industry. It's a not-for-profit company mandated by legislation and governed by a board. The scheme was established in 1993 to provide a free, independent and accessible service to assist providers and consumers resolve complaints they've been unable to resolve directly. We deal with complaints from both residential and small business consumers. The Telecommunications Consumer Protection and Service Standards Act requires all telecommunication carriers and carriage service providers to join the TIO scheme, to pay complaint handling fees for complaints made to the scheme, and to comply with the decisions of the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman is independent, and one of the mechanisms to ensure this is the structure of the board, which is made up of equal numbers of industry, consumer and independent directors. Our role includes supporting industry engagement, improvement, and we investigate systemic issues we see in complaints. However, the scheme has a distinct role from that of the industry regulator. While members have an obligation to comply with the scheme, enforcement sits with the sector regulator, the ACMA. In the period 1 July to 2019 to 30 June 2020, we received just over 127,000 complaints. This gives us a high-level insight into complaints in the sector, the complaints consumers have been unable to resolve with their provider. These complaints are, of course, a much larger picture, part of a much larger picture of complaints consumers make directly to and resolve directly with their telecommunications provider. The first stage of our complaints process is to document the complaint and refer it to the provider at a higher level. The provider then works directly with the consumer to resolve the complaint. If after 10 business days the complaint remains unresolved, the consumer can ask us for further assistance. The vast majority, between 85 and 90% of complaints, are resolved in the referral process. The 10 to 15% of complaints that return to us as unresolved are allocated to a case manager who then works with the parties to resolve the complaint. While we handle complaints between the consumer and the retail service provider with whom they have a contract, our terms of reference allow us to ask NBN Co to assist where needed. We also register some complaints directly against NBN Co, where the consumer has complained about NBN Co having damaged their property, or a landowner or occupier has objected to NBN Co accessing land to install low-impact infrastructure. As the network build nears completion, my office continues to work with sector, government and regulators to identify emerging issues. We work closely with NBN Co and providers to ensure that complaints are resolved and systemic issues addressed. Last year, the increasing complexity in fault and connection delay complaints particularly meant consumers had to wait a longer time for us to assign their complaint to a case manager. Over the past year, we have established small business and technical teams to give us additional specialist expertise. I also established a working group with NBN Co and some retail service providers to identify and resolve issues in these fault and connection complaints. And I'm pleased to say these initiatives have paid off, and we're now back to normal timeframes for filing complaints. Over the past few years, we've strengthened our data capture and visibility. Our revised keywords introduced in July 2017 are available on our website and in our annual report, and I provided a copy of these to your secretary for your background briefing. We've reintroduced quarterly reporting, which now includes reporting by network type. This more regular and granular reporting allows our stakeholders to have greater visibility over trends and complaints. As the industry evolves, we're continually making improvements to ensure the scheme continues to meet community expectations. You have my initial and supplementary submissions, as well as the reports on small business and COVID-19 systemic investigations undertaken by my office. The period since our January submission has included significant challenges for the sector and for consumers. Along with bushfires and floods at the start of the year, the global COVID-19 lockdowns meant overseas call centres and back office functions had to close for periods. As noted in our supplementary submission and in the annual report, there was a sharp rise in consumers not being able to contact their internet provider. Consumers told us telco issues were more disruptive as we all became increasingly reliant on being connected to live, work and study. Government, industry and NBN Co moved quickly to put in place measures to support businesses and individuals to stay connected, including hardship measures, financial support, release of additional CVC to providers and pricing measures. While complaints increased in the latter part of the year, the 2019-20 year saw an overall decline in complaints of 4%. We are anticipating, as government and providers wind back support measures, we'll see more hardship issues for residential and small business consumers. The data in our submissions to the committee looks at complaints about faults and connections. It shows complaints broken down by services delivered over the NBN and services delivered over other networks. We also report on these complaints in our annual and quarterly reports. In 2019-20, fault and connection complaints across all service types except mobile fell by 6.9%. But there was a shift in the network proportions, with complaints about services delivered over the NBN increasing by 5%. This was not surprising given the increase in consumers receiving their services over that network. As more consumers connect to the NBN, we expect to receive a greater proportion of complaints about services delivered over the NBN. During the 2019-20 year, we received a total of 35,601 fault and connection complaints about services delivered over the NBN, an increase of 5%. That same year, 1,735,306 new premises were activated on the NBN, and by the end of the year, over 7 million premises were connected to the NBN. However, much like the overall picture of complaints, for complaints about services delivered over the NBN, it was a year of two halves. During the first two quarters of 2019-20, before the pandemic, we saw an increase in complaints about faults and connections for services delivered over the NBN when compared to the previous year. During the second two quarters of 2019-20, during the pandemic, we received fewer complaints when compared to the previous year. We do anticipate that unresolved complaints about services delivered over the NBN will continue to become more complex as the rollout moves into the later stages. The later stages of the rollout will include connections that have been postponed due to their complexity. We are pleased with the way industry has adjusted its process to respond to challenges and complex connection issues, offering interim services and working with NBN Co to resolve issues. We've noted a decrease in complaints about missed appointments. However, some consumers continue to be particularly vulnerable to detriment, including voice-only consumers and small businesses that rely on network continuity. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the complaint figures I've provided. My Assistant Ombudsman, Ms. Brewer, is here to provide insight into any specific operational questions you may have that relate to complaints and how we resolve them. And Professor Lavash will be pleased to answer any questions you have about the governance of the scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Jones, for that comprehensive introduction. What I will do is just provide you with a quick explanation. We compartmentalise time on the basis of the makeup of the committee. The committee is made up of coalition members, members from the Australian Labor Party and members from independent and minor parties. Effectively today, that means we have Dr Haynes, Ms Templeman and me and some others on the line. I propose to allocate 20 minutes per grouping, and that will give us some extra time at the end, which I'm happy to allow over. I wonder if we were then to start with Ms Templeman, we'll then proceed to Dr Haynes and round out with coalition members for the last 20 minutes. So with that explanation, just so that we can understand why I'll be bringing people to a conclusion after 20 minutes, over to you, Ms Templeman.
He's a hard timekeeper. Thank you very much for that and for appearing, and again, apologies for that, it's a messy morning. One of the things that has struck me through reading your submission and additional submission is that and what I'm seeing in my own electorate of Macquarie, which is the Blue Mountains and the Hawkesbury, where we have a very mixed NBN rollout, is that there's a real intersection of the telecommunications issues, and it's not just NBN. The degree of the complexity is compounded by lack of mobile coverage, poor quality landlines and ADSL, and the three things merge. I'm just wondering, you're very good at compartmentalising it, and so, but to go to the bigger picture, how challenging is it and how is it changing that the complexity of the complaint and the potential for interim measures which might satisfy the complainant, is the complexity growing or is it getting simpler? I suppose I'm just after a big picture view that I'm hoping you will have. And I'm not sure who the best person is that. I can see Professor Lavash nodding, but I can't. So I'll throw it over to you, whoever would like to pick up.
Have a go at the first one, thanks, Ms Templeman.
Sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Sorry,
Yeah, certainly that intersectionality is something that we do see, and that's one of the reasons why we just report on complaints about services delivered over the NBN and other networks, because for the consumer, it doesn't actually matter what the underlying network is. The experience of difficulty with connection is the same, no matter the network. And we are really conscious through our data and through the complaints, through reading the complaints and listening to what consumers are telling us, that those difficult issues you talk about, particularly in that difficult terrain and also in rural, regional and indeed remote Australia, that intersectionality is absolutely at play. So in the more built up areas, it's very easy for us to say if there's a delay in connection, if there's an intermittent fault, if there's no service at all, then the consumer needs to have an interim service. There may well be a choice of interim services when you are in a built-up area, but in the area such as you've described in Macquarie and the Blue Arc Mountains, that's much more problematic. And during the bushfires and floods, we certainly saw some issues where the interim services had to be satellite phones, but at times there were shortages of those because of the widespread nature of the last bushfire season, and so there were some real challenges for consumers in those areas. Ms. Brewer, is there something that you would like to talk about from the complaints where your people have been involved in resolving them?
Yes, please
yes.
go ahead.
We handle complaints from the relatively simple, of course, to the very complex, and connection delays in areas where there is not particularly good mobile coverage do present much more challenging situations. Our aim is to look at what the situation is and to find the quickest possible resolution. If it's temporary but it works, it's better than not working at all, but we aim to have the problems fixed once and for all. But yes, we do. Many we can resolve very, very quickly within a few days. There are some that take us many months.
So if we look at the figures that you've provided, the number of complaints between April and June 2020 are not that different to the complaints for the same period the year before. So, we're particularly interested in the additional impacts that the pandemic has had on NBN services. But that seems to indicate that there wasn't a big increase in complaints that came to you, or were there other factors involved?
I think that there was, if we look at the complaints, I talked about complaints about services delivered over the NBN as being a year of two halves, and for general complaints across the board, that was also true, but in a different way. So last year, complaints were continuing to trend down, a trend that had started at the latter part of the previous reporting year. But when the pandemic hit, we saw an increase in complaints. So overall, a decline of 4%, but down last calendar year and then up this year, resulting in that overall picture. What we saw was a difference in the things that people were contacting us about. So, the startling number in our annual report of a 1,500% increase in complaints from consumers who were unable to contact their internet provider. What we did see in the complaints that came to us was the impact was more important for consumers. So not having a working internet service impacted not just watching Netflix of an evening when you were home from work, but impacted your kids' ability to learn and your ability to be able to continue to be employed by working from home, or for small businesses where they were pivoting to have a completely online interaction with their consumers. So yes, the issues seem to be much the same, perhaps up a little bit in volume from what we might have expected from the trend last year, but the impact was different, and there was that uptick in providers being uncontactable in the early stages of the shutdowns overseas.
And that accounts for the sort of the shift in themes that you've identified. What other trends and differences are emerging, especially as the pandemic continues, really, rather than is a short, sharp thing?
We're waiting to see a an increase in complaints about hardship and problems paying a bill. We think that will come, but by the end of the year, it wasn't showing up as a particular issue. It was starting to rise, but not dramatically. It actually dropped off as an important issue in the first stages of the pandemic, I think because of financial support measures that were in place, and also because people were perhaps focusing on other things. I don't know, but that was starting to come back up, and that's what we're expecting to see as a change as the pandemic continues.
Can you talk me through that a bit more? I suppose some of the reasons why you're anticipating that based on the experiences that you've had to date, and what steps you would take to be assisting consumers in resolving those issues, and what some of your expectations might be from the providers.
Well, when there is a hardship in the community, there is hardship in paying telco bills. And when we are increasingly reliant, the phrase is now more than ever in these unprecedented times, and we do need to be connected much more. It is much more of an essential service. So people will need to be connected, and they may also be struggling financially. That's not just being connected for work and study, but also mental health issues to remain socially connected to friends and family. So what's happening in society will be mirrored in our complaints. We prioritise hardship complaints, so where people are struggling, may have had their service suspended because they're unable to pay a bill. Certainly Ms Brewer and her team prioritise those and assign them as quickly as possible. We expect providers, they're required to have hardship measures by the Telecommunications Consumer Protection Code. We expect those to be accessible and for consumers to be able to get that financial support or be put on the right plan, to be allowed time to pay off their bills on a reasonable time frame so that they can both meet their financial commitments to the telco and remain connected. We also work closely with Financial Counsellors Australia and would be working with them on other things that we can do to support consumers. And it's a matter for the regulator as well as to what changes they might have in their mandatory expectations for telcos in that time.
Based on the conversations and complaints from customers, what's your assessment about how profound the impact is if people aren't able to come to a resolution and lose their particularly NBN service?
Do you mean from financial hardship?
Yeah, as a result of financial hardship. If you're not able to find a resolution through a complaint to the TIO, are you able to, based on the stories that you hear and the data that you collect, identify what sort of impact that may have? If there's not a resolution? Well,
there will generally be a resolution of some kind offered to the consumer, whether it's one they want to accept. It might be a different issue. We know that if you're having trouble paying your bills, it's not just paying a telco bill, it's paying all your bills. And so we've established a transfer between us and the Energy and Water Ombudsman here in Victoria, but also extending it out to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, to the other Energy and Water Ombudsman, so that if a consumer contacts any one of us about a problem paying a bill and they're also struggling to pay the other bills, it's easy for them to then contact us so that we can put them into the complaints process in our sector as well. I think that what we see as the consequences is probably as much as you know. So we understand just from being ordinary people that if you're not connected to the internet, then you struggle. A lot of government services are online now. Job seeker markets are online, so that not having access to a connection to the internet it is very problematic for people. And if you're a small business, extremely problematic.
So in terms of the financial relief that NBN Co has offered to consumers in the pandemic, can you talk me through what you've seen of that relief and what might happen when that ends?
Are you talking there, Ms. Templeton, about the CVC increase?
Yeah, yes, additional capacity for people through CVC.
Yeah, so that was capacity that was released to the providers, not directly to consumers. So that's about the ability of providers to give consumers additional data to allow them to act for the same price. So it's like all the other support measures. When those are wound back, then we expect to see increasing financial hardship. We don't deal with the back-to-back arrangements between NBN Co and the retail service providers. We don't deal with pricing issues, but certainly that release of additional CVC charge to the providers enabled them to increase the data allowance to consumers.
And presumably it meant, where it's been clear to this committee that has been passed through to consumers and has been a relief to many consumers. So presumably you don't hear about it when it's a good news story. You would only have heard about it when if something had gone wrong for consumers, in as much as they weren't getting the data they anticipated. Did you get have you had complaints from consumers who had, in this pandemic time, where data capacity has been an issue, or is that one of the areas where complaints have gone down?
We certainly do get complaints about people not getting the speeds that they were anticipating, and that's something that's been a feature in the pandemic to some extent, although it's more about no working service or delay establishing a service that are in the top 5 of the issues. So we didn't really see complaints about not having enough data. I know that, for example, I increased my plan. I migrated to the NBN during the pandemic because I could no longer put up with my 5 megabits a second ADSL service in order to do my work. And so that's been a feature, but we haven't really specifically seen complaints about consumers and their data allowances.
So when I guess, can we just talk CVC more broadly, separate to the pandemic, just in terms of the role it plays in the complaints that you handle? Have you identified it as an underlying issue generally?
When we look at complaints about services delivered over the NBN, we look at it, the issues in that, what we tag fault and connection complaints, so that's what we're looking at. And when we're looking at complaints about speed, then CVC can be a factor in that. So if the retail service provider hasn't got enough CVC for the number of consumers they've got connected, then that will be a constraint on the speed. So we certainly used to see a lot more complaints about speed constraints than we have been now. I wonder, Ms. Brewer, whether there's something that, from the work that your team does, whether you're still seeing that as an issue.
We receive speed complaints, and I suppose it's fair to say in the current climate where everybody's working from home, well, not everybody, but many people are working from home, and they've been trying to school the kids at home as well. There's a lot of pressure put on home networks, and speed is one of the things we see. The reasons for slow speed are probably varied and many, and at the end of the day, for a consumer, they don't care what the cause is, they just want it fixed. And for some, that means upgrading to a higher plan. I've done that at home with 5 adults living in the house. For some, it means moving to another provider that can offer a higher grade of service. There are many tiers of service, and so we just aim to work out what's the best for each consumer.
Can I ask you, Ms. Brewer, just around, there's been a few comments today about you guys have upgraded plans. I'm curious about how often complaints come through where a consumer is reluctant to pay for a higher plan and whether that is a factor. We're just trying to, one of the things we've been exploring is sort of consumer expectations around what they should pay versus what they should receive, particularly when it comes to small businesses who are home-based. And I'm just wondering how much that features, those issues feature in the complaints that you get, and what sorts of resolutions you've found have been acceptable.
Well, interestingly, when I upgraded my plan, it didn't cost me any more because I was on such an old plan that times have moved on, and so I've got a higher speed for exactly the same price. I think there are hundreds of plans out there on the market, and yes, it's quite likely that some consumers have had to pay more in order to keep going through the pandemic. But I suspect there are others who've managed to get higher plans. I can't tell you numbers, but there are so many plans and providers who cater to different markets. And so I'd like to think that people have got the option to get better speed for not much more money, but I'm sorry I couldn't give you any numbers.
So you haven't had any complaints around that where people have come to you saying, I'm just not happy with the alternatives that my provider is offering?
Well, we deal in people who are unhappy with the alternatives that they've been offering. That's why we exist. And so then it's a matter of us talking to the parties to the complaint to see if there are alternatives or whether this is in fact the best you're going to get. But there are often alternatives, and that's where we step in. We step in where two parties can't see eye to eye and can't work out how to resolve a problem and help them find a way forward by suggesting other options.
But I think it's fair to say that we don't start on that because often that's a matter of...
Can you hang on a second? We've just lost your sound.
Miss Jones, you've just gone very quiet. That's better. I can hear you now, I think.
Yes.
All right.
Yes, perfect.
We have all sorts of technical issues this morning. We don't collect data about that because there's nothing we can do to make the market provide different plans or make them reduce a plan so the consumer can afford it. So it's about trying to match the two together rather than make the market provide something that it doesn't want to provide. So I don't think our data is the best source of information for that issue for you.
Look, I know my time's about to expire here, but I'm interested in the relationship and how the system is working between the different providers. Particularly in my office, we see lots of issues where it's not clear if it's an NBN issue or an RSP issue. And so from a relationship and a governance perspective, what your observations are about how that system is working from a resolution of complaints perspective, from TIO's perspective?
Look, it's working a lot better than it used to, and that is the big question. Where is the problem occurring, and who needs to do what to fix it? So that's the problem-solving approach we take. We changed our terms of reference a couple of years ago to be able to require wholesalers, other parties involved in the delivery to the consumer to work with us on resolution of the complaint. So we can, and our relationship with NBN Co is certainly very positive. At any stage, any of the people in Jill's team can pick up the phone, call a contact person at NBN Co and have them provide us with information or expertise to help us understand what the particular issues are in the complaint. We've found that over the past, certainly in the past year, that NBN Co sees consumers as effectively their customers in a strict legal sense. The providers are, of course, their direct customer, but they have a great interest in having things working well for the consumer. So we've found that working relationship is much better. And as I said in my opening remarks, when last year we had this significant increase in complex fault and connection complaints, I sent a email to the chief executives of NBN Co and the retail service providers involved and said, send me your best people. We need to work together on this. And there was no hesitation. And we met really regularly, lots of exchanges of information, lots of work done to understand the issues, not just resolve the issues and the complaints we were seeing, but they were looking backwards to say, okay, what are the triggers? What can we see early on that will allow us to identify this is a complaint that if we don't get on top of it now, is likely to end up at the TIO or end up becoming more complex to resolve. So it's not perfect. 127,000 complaints shows there's still work to be done. But we find that by and large, the retail service providers and NBN Co are very interested in sorting out the problems that consumers are reporting.
Okay, over
Thank
to you,
you.
Dr. Haynes.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Ms Jones and Ms Brewer and Professor Lavache for your witness today. I'm interested in the workings of the TIO in so much as your powers to investigate and compel NBN to resolve issues. I quite often have constituents call me to say that TIO has now told them the matter needs to go to their federal MP. So I'm curious to know what situations there would be when that would be where you were left in your advice to a complainant, and what actual powers that you currently have to investigate and resolve complaints about the NBN specifically. And I don't mind who answers, just one of you could comment on that, please.
Thanks. It's a great question. I would like to think that that was not something we resorted to very commonly to say we can't do anything and you should talk to your federal MP. We know that you have work to do as well. I suspect, and I'll defer to Ms Brewer in a minute, but I suspect that it is when there needs to be, it might be that the bill doesn't come their way, or there's provisioning to be done that is going to take time. It is, we can't direct NBN Co to reallocate its resources and to roll out the network to an area where it isn't currently on its plan. We can't make them find a technician. They might be waiting for a specialist technician, and sometimes that does take time to happen. So we have the powers to have them work with us. We have the powers to provide the information, and where there is something to be done to fix it, they will fix it. At the end of the day, if I need to, I can make a binding decision against a provider to have them implement a remedy for the consumer. By and large, those remedies, when it comes to me for a binding decision, by and large, the remedies I'm directing providers to provide to the consumer are financial. I don't think I have ever made a decision where I'm directing a provider to do something technical to fix some part of the network, because generally those are things that they really want to have happen. Jill, can you comment?
In terms of technical complaints that are either false or connection delays, we work, the complaint is logged against the provider, the consumer's provider. They've got the contractual relationship and the working relationship with the consumer, but we are able to get NBN into the conversation, and we do that quite quickly. So we collect a baseline of data from the consumer about what the complaint involves, and we send it to the RSP, the retail service provider, and often we'll send the same to NBN Co. And then those heads all get together to work out what needs to happen. Things we cannot look into include the technology type that's being proposed or which is being delivered to a particular consumer, and that often is something the consumer raises, or the backup of mobile reception if something goes awry. That might be where we would say, look, talk to your MP about the black spot program and whether there's some representations that can be made there. But for technical faults, that would not be the sort of thing I would anticipate we would ever refer to an MP. They're very difficult. They're not traditional problems that dispute resolution services would deal with, which, negotiation and conciliation can bring around a result that everyone's happy with. They're complaints that need people with technical skills to go in and look at fibre and joints and towers and so forth. And so they're necessarily fairly time-consuming often and difficult, but we wouldn't be sending anyone like that to an MP.
Do you feel that you have adequate powers and resources to fully investigate the complaints?
Well, we do. We talk directly with NBN Co. We talk with NBN Co. and the retail service provider in conference calls and get to the bottom of what is happening. And complaints resolve. They might not necessarily resolve in a week or a couple of days, but we keep going until we get them fixed.
And can I maybe, Dr. Haynes, just comment on the resourcing question you just asked there? The short answer is yes. The scheme is self-funding and obviously within the constraints of the members always wanting us to run efficiently and being appropriately cost conscious. We are able to determine our own budget. Our budget for this financial year is a bit over 35 million. Something like that, 250 staff working in the organisation. It's a challenging business in as much as the complaint numbers can be quite volatile almost year on year. It's not all that uncommon to see complaint numbers either move up sort of 10% in a 12-month period or decline 10% in a 12-month period. So adjusting the resource base appropriately to be able to respond to that is a business challenge for the organisation. But we certainly do have the capacity to ensure the organisation is appropriately resourced when we do get peaks in demand for our services.
Thank you. So, and you're also confident that you feel that you have the resources to really adequately investigate to the best of your ability and customer satisfaction.
Well, we think we have sufficient resources, understanding this is very much a shared space. Obviously, there is an appropriate role for the regulator, which has within its remit now a particular focus on the IDR, the internal dispute resolution processes of providers. Government itself sets frameworks in terms of consumer protection, in terms of the directions and policies which are set. So all the moving parts have to fit together, obviously. But in terms of do we have the resources necessary to meet our part of this jigsaw puzzle, from the board's perspective, we would say yes.
Thanks very much, Professor Lavach. Can I just turn your mind to the fibre rollout, and I'm interested in consultation about that. I've had some correspondence from constituents interested in getting a community submission together and having their say on the process of the rollout of fibre of the NBN. And they're keen to hear more about how they can get involved themselves and want NBN to be accountable to the community for decisions taken during this new round of fibre rollout, particularly to ensure that it happens in regional areas as well as metropolitan ones. And our small businesses are very interested in this. I'm curious to know what role that the TIO can play in ensuring decisions made by NBN Co about fibre rollout are accountable to consumers who may feel left behind or unfairly treated in those decisions.
That's not really something that we get involved in. We're not in charge of the rollout. We're not oversighting the rollout. So we're dealing with the problems that consumers have as they arise. We look at our data, we see the patterns in it, we report on it, we have input into policy submissions when the regulatory framework is being updated or changed or reviewed. But in terms of the direction of the rollout, where it should be best placed, how the new upgrade to the network that's been recently announced should be implemented, that's not something that would be appropriate for us as an Ombudsman service to participate in.
I expect, as you mentioned, the complexity of your complaints are increasing. I'm putting in a bet that there may be some complexity around this too, just judging from what I'm hearing in the community. Look, I've got a couple of case studies actually, or that I'm curious to get your view on around small businesses in some of my more isolated areas, and there's one that I have where it's in a rather remote place, Kinglake West, where they've been having slow NBN since lines were first installed. Telstra's told them that the lines can't take any more than 27 MPS, that they have slow internet. 2 years on, NBN told this community too that they'd upgrade the lines within 12 months, but this never came. And in recent times, the internet's slowing right down now to 13 MPS, and the NBN's response referred them to the corporate plan of 2021, which outlines how they'll provide access to higher wholesale speeds and greater capability, which would estimate to get to 75% of homes and businesses by 2023. But NBN can't comment on which areas would be included in that 75% estimate. And I'm curious from your perspective, do you think that's a satisfactory response from the NBN? And what could you do? Is that a role that the TIO would get involved with in a situation such as this?
I think it is really challenging for small businesses and indeed for residential consumers when their network is not performing, when there is a degradation of the copper, meaning that it is not receiving the optimal service and certainly not receiving the service that they can see is available in other areas. In terms of whether we would get involved and suggest to NBN Co that they change their corporate plan, no. As I say, we are more focused on those individual complaints. What can we do to fix the individual problem rather than directing how the rollout should take place?
Would it be a role for TIO to ask for transparency, though, around which geographical areas would be in that 75% estimate? Is that a reasonable thing for TIO to investigate?
Well, that would be, if we were to investigate anything like that, it would have to be stemming from complaints. So what are we seeing in complaints that makes that an issue? And when you come down to the investigation of individual complaints, it's about fixing those problems, but not about directing NBN Co on the rollout, as I said. And I think that's probably more of an issue for the regulator, for the government to look at that way that's happening.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. How am I going for time, Chair?
You've got about 7.5 minutes.
Okay, good. All right. I've got another scenario again, just trying to get a sense of what you think is reasonable from NBN. So again, in a remote area of the electorate, where a small business is trying very hard to run their business, NBN not able to offer any fibre to the node, not able to offer wireless, and too far away for wireless, and satellite not recommended because the area is too cloudy. So on ADSL2, and you mentioned yourself, there's problems with that when it's wet. This is a very wet area. So the service cuts out a lot. And the small upload capacity of ADSL means they can't use cloud-based storage to support off-site staff, of which they have many. And it's been a particular issue in the pandemic. And moreover, during the pandemic, just no bandwidth really. They can't video conference because of the limited capacity. So, again, like most small businesses, really having a go here. They've trialled hybrid delivery and fully digital delivery of their products. It took them 6 months, 6 staff, $42,000. But because of the limited upload capacity, they're still severely limited in their ability to maintain their business and certainly can't grow their business. So I'm just, again, curious from your perspective. This business and others like them, frustrated, can't get an improved service from the NBN. Would you consider that reasonable from the NBN? And is there anything that TIO could do in a situation such as this?
I think that it's very, very frustrating. When you can't actually get the upgrades that you need to get the service that you would like. If we were looking at that complaint, we'd be looking at whether there was anything that could be done, given the service available. I don't know, Ms. Brewer, do you have something that you would suggest?
I think it would be worthwhile for your constituent to raise a complaint with our office. As I say, we get all the parties in the room talking together, and that's a much more effective way of dealing with the problem than it is talking to one person here and one person there.
Yes.
I couldn't promise any wonderful outcomes, but we could certainly get everyone talking together and see what the best outcome possible would be.
Thank you. So it is something that you would investigate carefully with, though. Yeah, good. I mean, there's 42 jobs associated with this particular business.
Well, slow speeds and dropouts and an inability to trade is something that we look at quite regularly. And as I say, the more people looking into it at the same time and talking to each other, the better chance we have of resolving it.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Ms. Brewer. That's all the questions I have. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes. Over to me. Can I just start with a couple of points of clarification for me? Firstly, it's just a question that's jumped in my head and I wouldn't mind the answer, it's not particularly relevant, but does the TIO have responsibility for those infrastructure providers outside of NBN? So the small startup providers that provide some infrastructure in competition with the NBN? Just interested.
Yeah, we have, so our jurisdiction, when we record complaints, we're looking at the relationship between the consumer and their retail service provider. So if you've got a contract with a retail service provider and there's something not going right, we can look at that complaint. It doesn't matter who the carrier is behind the scenes, the wholesale of the network that you're on. If it's a telecommunications service that you've got a contract with your provider, then we can look at it. So yeah, the startups, the alternative suppliers, the alternative networks, absolutely.
Great, thanks. Ms Jones, the other point of clarification before I get to my questions is something you said earlier about the CVC and in particular the 40% uptake. I think I heard you say that the 40% CVC boost would allow retail service providers to pass on additional data to their customers. That's not correct though, is it? I mean, the 40% CVC is about effectively capacity in the network, the size of the pipe, smoothing the experience. It's not about extra data, at the household.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. You had me a little concerned because I regard myself as the Luddite in this space, and I'd at least come to that understanding, and I thought, here's a expert throwing me into a state of confusion. So, thank you.
Thank you.
The next couple of questions are really about the complaints profile. I'm fascinated by this because it says a lot, and it should, as it does, inform both the NBN, the retail service providers, and decision makers around, what's working and what's not. Firstly, are we? It's difficult, isn't it, in terms of distinctions. Complaints delivered over NBN could be a complaint about a retail service provider, but it also could be a complaint about the infrastructure provider, couldn't it, NBN? Is that right?
The
When
cause
you
of the
talk about statistics in the space of complaints delivered over NBN.
Yeah, and that's why we use that phrase, even though it's a mouthful, quite carefully. So it's a complaint about a service that happens to be delivered over the NBN. And we look at those complaints when we're doing the problem solving, where Ms. Brewer and her team are doing that problem solving. We find that the problem could be anywhere. So if it's a complaint about slow speed, it could be about the provisioning, could be about it being a fibre to the node connection and the copper, it could be the length you are from the distance you are from the node, it could be a problem indeed in your own household with your wiring or the positioning of the modem. There's a lot of factors that could be included in it. So the fact that we report it, note that it is a complaint about a service delivered over the NBN does not necessarily mean that there's a problem with the network itself, or indeed a problem or some action that NBN Co itself should take. It can be, but it could be a range of other factors as well.
Yeah, so complaints regarding services delivered over the NBN cannot be read as complaints re-NBN.
Correct.
Yeah. Just another point. Well, on that, and just to take it a bit further, is there anywhere that we publish or that you publish the breakdown within that category, i.e. complaints that the cause for which can be attributed to the network versus complaints the cause for which could be attributed to the retail service provider?
No.
Right.
Not big. For a range of reasons. I think it's important to understand why. Yeah. Remember, I said that the vast majority of complaints, 85 to 90%, are resolved directly between the retail service provider and the consumer. So we don't know what the outcome was, where the problem was identified, how they fixed it. And even for the ones that come back, the 10 to 15%, where we do get involved and do more work, sometimes those are fixed without us knowing exactly how it was fixed. So it would be a very small data set and probably not sufficient to be particularly informative.
I'm really grateful for your fulsome introduction, to be honest, because it answered most of the questions that I had. But and if you said this in your introduction, I apologise because I missed it. But do we have any indication of the breakup of complaints that come to you regarding an NBN service, retail service versus business service? Do you keep that data?
Yes, we do. So it's broken down by small businesses and residential consumers. So that's reported on in our annual report and in our quarterlies too, I think. Generally, across the board, complaints generally, it's about 15% of our complaints are from a small business. And for residential, then it's 85%. And that was increasing for a while. That proportion of small business complaints was increasing for a while, but it's this year it remained relatively steady.
So that's a proportion of overall complaints. How does that compare? So 15% of complaints come from a small business. How does that compare in relation to overall connections? Are 15% of our nation's connections small business type connections, or you wouldn't know?
Well, we
so
don't
I'm just
know
interested in the proportionality, i.e. are we getting a disproportionately high number of complaints from business as opposed to residential?
Yeah. That's a very good question and a very tricky question to answer, because small business customers don't necessarily have a small business account. They might be operating their small business, it might be a micro business, but operating from home on a residential account. But also we don't have information on the services and operations, so we don't have that data on how many services and what the profile is but in providers on whether they service small business customers or residential consumers.
Ms Jones, thank you for the answer. Yeah. I'll build on it in a minute, particularly that comment that often we find people operating businesses off, if you like, residential grade services and the complications and issues that kind of presents, which is something I want to talk about in a couple of other questions. But before I get to that one, I wonder if anyone, either yourself or Professor Lavarch, might be in a position, given the scale of the NBN rollout, we're now talking 11.8 million Australian homes and businesses, and more than 7.6 million homes now connected to the network. In your opinion, if you're prepared to offer one, and given the challenges impacting the entire telecommunications industry this year, given bushfires, flood, and of course a 1 in 100 year global pandemic, how would you rate NBN Co's performance over that period?
I'll have a first crack at that if you like, Mr. Chair. I'd say very good, very good. I mean, I think maybe like a lot of the community, I sort of held my breath when the pandemic started to fall. Yeah, that's right. Literally, in order to stop the spread as well. But to see how the system was going to hold up, from our perspective, in terms of the number of complaints that have come our way, in terms of the responsiveness of not simply the NBN, but all of the service providers, the major providers, willing to sit down with us, initially on a day-by-day basis, and then later on as things settled and we got a good understanding on a week-by-week basis to meet with us. The system has responded very well, and I mean, if it hadn't, we would have seen that. Now, we did get those complaints about when the call centres collapsed in the Philippines, and we did have that moment of people not being able to contact their provider. But overall, I think we can be very pleased with how well the system has coped.
I think that's right, and indeed the year of two halves for our data generally, as I said, there was a decrease in complaints about services delivered over the NBN in the second half of our year. So that's a little bit counterintuitive, considering our other pattern of complaints, but the numbers show that.
Excellent. Can I just double back? In terms of complaints, you can and often do, don't you, receive complaints about retail service providers' billing? Is that a significant component of the work you do?
The most common reason for a residential consumer or small business to contact us is about a problem on a bill and about delayed or no action by a provider. So that's the customer service comparison. But generally, those will be associated with another issue. So we can record more than one issue per complaint. So a consumer may complain about their internet speed and say, and therefore, I don't think I should have to pay the money that you're charging me. So the two often come together.
Kind of connected, yeah. The next questions go back to that issue around choice of plan, retail, business, or indeed, I want to ask some questions around whether people are making the right decisions when it comes to their own, home plans. The NBN's been around for a decade now. Are you concerned about the level of literacy amongst consumers regarding the nature of plans, and in particular also the nature of the system, namely NBN, wholesale, infrastructure provider, other retail service providers? I'm just interested in your comments about that level of literacy and whether you're concerned, given that we've been in this space for some time now, and at least in my view, it doesn't seem to be improving any bit.
I think it is, my previous role was as an energy ombudsman back in New Zealand, and my view is that it should be like energy. You shouldn't have to know about the network provider to understand how your electricity is being delivered to your house. You contact your retail energy company and you get the electricity delivered You don't need to know about the frequency keeping and all the other stuff that goes on in the background. It shouldn't matter to the consumer what network their service is delivered over. They should be able to contract with the retail service provider and get the experience that retail service provider has promised to them. What the retail service provider does behind the scenes to ensure that happens shouldn't need to be front of mind for the consumer. Having said that, the complexity of plans is confusing for consumers, and that's sometimes some of those hardship cases involves us looking at what would be a better plan. Do people need to be on a prepaid plan to manage their expenses more appropriately? Certainly, it's that confounding nature of choice. If there's a great deal of choice in the market, then there's also a great deal often of complexity in the pricing plans that consumers have to make decisions between.
So double-barreled question. Are retailers failing to offer the right information to consumers in that space? And should they be taking a more active role in educating their customers about the type of plan that customers should be taking up given particular customers' kind of needs and circumstances?
We did a systemic investigation into mis-selling of NBN plans, where we found that some telephone salespeople, particularly, were misrepresenting the plans to consumers. They were misrepresenting to consumers, telling them that they had to, their network was about to be switched off and they had to switch now, and that they could only switch to the provider that was calling them on the phone. So, there are issues around that. In our small business systemic investigation we published a report on last year, that was one of the things that the providers could do better, was to make sure that they clearly understood or explained in simple language to their customer what were the particular features of this plan. There is the customer information standard that requires standard information to be provided to consumers to help them easily compare plans, but certainly retail service providers are clearly explaining in simple terms to their consumers what it is that they're signing up for, and also consumers asking good questions about saying what it is they want and how will that plan meet their needs.
That leads me to, and thank you for your answer earlier about literacy, that dealt with the architecture of the system. What about consumer understanding so that they can ask those informed questions about speed, service, assistance, these things? Do you think that the consumer is sufficiently literate on average to be in a position to make good choices when it comes to migrating to the NBN or rolling over plans?
Look, I think it's challenging. I think there is a variety of expertise out there. I was interestingly talking to my nephew here in Melbourne, who had just migrated to the NBN some time ago, and I said, "Oh, what's the technology type?" And he said, "What do you mean?" Now, he's a very intelligent man who had a very technologically advanced household. He had an internal network, lights and all sorts of things connected to the internet. But he had no idea that there was an issue, a question like that needed the answer, and he had no idea how to answer it. So there is a variety of understanding out there, and that's where it is important that people do explain it clearly to people. I think it's particularly challenging for older consumers who are voice-only customers who don't want an internet service. All they want is a landline to continue to work the way their landline has already worked, and they certainly need some additional assistance in making the right choice.
So is there more that the retail service providers and or government can do to improve literacy in this space for consumers?
It's a great question. I think there's always more that can be done because it's a bit like it's just-in-time information. So you don't need that information until the moment you're going to make the choice, so that you can send out all the information you like. But if you're not needing it, you just it's not relevant to you at the time. So we do encourage retail service providers to be very clear, use simple language, explain it to their customers clearly, and take into account the person they're speaking to.
I often compare the NBN and internet services to Medicare. Now, the only reason I say this is the average Australian can be plucked off the street and they can explain to you how Medicare operates, gaps, private service providers, GPs, specialists, and these things. I just wonder, it's taken us 40 years to develop that kind of, if you like, understanding by osmosis. I wonder whether we might get to the same place in relation to this technology delivery, but it just will take time. I'm very interested to see if we can expedite that that understanding. I just want to, in the bit of time I've got, you recommend in your report that a focus on shared responsibility during fault periods can reduce time to fix a problem. Can you perhaps expand on this for our purposes?
Sure. So when there is a problem with your service, you do have to work with the retail service provider to help problem solve it. So it's not just a matter of ringing up and saying my network is too slow. There may be things that you have to do to help them resolve the issue. So, for example, you might need to go and turn your modem on and off. You might need to change some of the settings. It's important that you do work together on those things. You might need to try some different settings on your computer. You might, a range of things that perhaps Ms. Brill could explain more fully than me. But certainly, it's not just a matter of ringing up, logging the complaint, and then going, I'm just waiting for them to fix it. It is something that it works better if you problem solve with the provider. You'll know things about your setup. You'll know, for example, my office here, my home office is in my back bedroom. It's not line of sight to the modem. The provider will need to know perhaps where your telephone line comes in. I'm on fibre to the node. Where the telephone line comes in, and could you shift your modem somewhere else to improve the service? Ms. Brewer, is there things that you would like to add?
Well, yes, with any fault complaint, troubleshooting is really vital. The provider's not there in your living room with you looking at your setup. One of our team members put it quite nicely in our annual report. It's moving people from what's happened to me or what's happening to me now to how can we fix this, what's the way forward. And that does require everybody in there discussing and troubleshooting together. And it's by far the fastest way to get a problem resolved. And in many cases, we'll have NBN in the room with us, or the virtual room, contributing as well to getting them fixed. So it's not a problem that one person can fix.
So just in relation to small business, what measures can they take to expedite repairs of faults?
Reporting them as soon as they occur. Sometimes people think they're too busy. That's often not the way to go. Working with the provider, keeping very good records of when things go down and what the symptoms are. It's a bit like going to the doctor and explaining, you can say, I feel sick, or you can tell the doctor what your symptoms are, and that's a much better way. So I would say that's the same for small businesses.
This might be a question for Professor Lavarch, but NBN is making a $700 million investment in the small to medium business segment. What are the TIO's observations on what this initiative will achieve for small to medium-sized businesses across the country?
Well, I don't know if we have any specific observations as such. Obviously, as the network strengthens, as there is a response to demand, as I understand the government's announcement, which is to expand the network, and particularly the fibre network, where consumers have a demand sort of profile which necessitates and will see their services improve that way, that small businesses will improve, that this will be a superior outcome. So certainly, from our perspective, we operate very much in a shared space. Our relationships have to be with our consumers, very much with our retail service provider members, with the NBN, with other elements of the system to work together to resolve problems. Now, as the underlying infrastructure improves, then it follows that the overall consumer experience and small business experience will also improve.
Excellent. Colleagues, that's the end of my questions. There's 5 minutes. I'll hand it over.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to pick up on a few of the issues that have come out. And I'm just interested in the increase in complaints by small business, now at 14.7% of all complaints. And the thinking about how we pick up on those themes of small business being part of the solution for the problems they might be facing with their NBN. And I suppose I just want to give a scenario and try and understand what you would be suggesting the process was for resolving this. And I'll take my own circumstance. Until I was in Parliament, I was running a business from home, having relocated to home when dial-up ended and ADSL became available all those years ago, which seemed like a revelation. The issue is that many people in my community don't have mobile phone access at home. So I've been trying to work through what would happen if my NBN was down and that meant my landline was gone. I don't have mobile phone reception within my home unless I'm using my internet, because I use Wi-Fi calling to give me mobile reception inside my house. So my provider says to me, excuse me, okay, we need you to do some stuff. How do I actually do that if I have literally no phone signal, mobile phone signal in my home? I have no NBN. I really don't have a backup. So I'm curious in terms of how you would work through that resolution, because I think more and more that's going to become a dilemma. Until a couple of months ago, I would have had a landline prior to NBN being recently connected. Can you talk me through how on earth that might get resolved?
It's the intersection that you were talking about earlier. It's a really confounding problem. I'll hand over to Ms. Brewer to talk to that.
Thank you.
That's a very tricky problem. There are cases where there is nothing other to be done than to send a technician out. And so I think in those sorts of circumstances, it's explaining clearly to your provider why you cannot troubleshoot, why it's just impossible, and saying we just have to get a technician out. There are technicians who can do this sort of work. And
is there a charge involved by the provider for that technician, or is that covered by my agreement with them in some way?
Look, there are charges for some things and not charges for others. But of course, if you were in our office, many things are negotiable, and stating your position and your case, providers, they want their customers to be happy. They want their customers to stay with them. So we have a lot of negotiation, and the beauty of coming to a dispute resolution service is it allows people to see each other's perspectives, which is not necessarily possible on chat or just talking to someone over the phone.
Would it not make sense for people, when you sign up to your plan, if you're clear that you know when your NBN goes down you've got no alternative, for there to be options that you can choose or request or have an agreement around prior to there being a problem? And are there any plans where that sort of support is evident? And obviously I'm asking based on the experience you've got in dealing with consumers around this matter.
I'm not aware of any plans to that effect. That doesn't mean they're not out there. Certainly, consumers with medical priority illnesses and so forth, that can be noted. So if a consumer is in that position and they have a medical issue that requires them to be able to connect to ambulance and so forth, then registering as a priority assistance customer would be the way to go. I think there's nothing to be lost by explaining to your retail service provider what your situation is to see what they can offer.
And in the experiences that you've seen, the irony is if providers do provide a technical support service to someone's home or small business, you probably don't get to hear the story because it gets resolved at that level before coming to you. That would be the case generally, wouldn't it? So you'll only see where that hasn't happened with a consumer.
We see things where they go wrong.
Yeah, just like us.
What we do.
Indeed.
That's right, and we might see it in might get it escalated to us as a referral, and then when we refer it back to the provider at a higher level, they're then able to resolve the problem. And as I said earlier, we just don't know how it's fixed, but we know that it is.
Can I ask a question?
One last one and then we'll round out.
Okay. I just wanted to pick up on the question that you had around the breakdown of the types of technology. Is it likely going forward that for a start, have you got any data on the breakdown of complaints around fibre to the premises, fibre to the node, wireless, satellite, HFC? I feel like I'm leaving something out. Fibre to the curb. Do you have any? I was just double checking all the charts and things that I have. I'm just wondering whether you have that data, even though it's not published.
Look, we don't. When the 127,000 consumers contact us to make a complaint, we focus on collecting the data that we need to get to the provider to help them resolve that complaint in the first instance. So consumers, as we discussed a little bit earlier, don't always know what's happening behind the scenes. They might not know when we're on the NBN even. They might not know the technology type. It might be a financial counsellor making the complaint on their behalf. So we don't routinely at the moment collect that data at referral. So that's for the vast majority. The provider, once they get the complaint, of course, will have the information about what kind of network it is and what kind of technology type. Where the complaint comes back to us as unresolved, if it's a service delivered over the NBN and if it's relevant to the complaint, then yes, Ms. Brewer's team will go onto the NBN website and look at the technology type and add that into the data. So we don't have it sufficiently robustly or to add it to our reporting at the moment. It is, of course, part of the ACMA's reporting on their under their record-keeping rules on the complaints made directly to providers. And it's also reported on in the ACCC's broadband monitoring program, the speeds by technology type.
And is it something that you would be looking to collect more data on as you, as the use of the NBN, gets to completion and things change with different technology delivery things?
We're always looking to improve both our data collection and our reporting, and so watch the space. We're continuing to evolve.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
With that, Helen?
One other
Go.
component to that. Do you have any intel from your data on a split between rural and regional complaints compared with metro, for example?
We used to report by postcode, but it wasn't particularly meaningful because it wasn't normalised either against the size of population or by the number of services in operation in that area. We certainly know that we receive far fewer complaints from rural and regional than we do for metro, as you would expect with the way the population is distributed. What we do know is that when there is a problem, as Ms Templeton's questioning has confirmed, that there is much greater impact on those consumers and small businesses for those more far-flung areas.
Excellent. That draws our time together to a close. Can I take this opportunity to thank you, Professor Lavarch, you, Ms Jones and Ms Brewer, not just for making yourself available to give evidence today and for your submissions, but if other colleagues in this place run electorate offices anything like mine, we are incredibly grateful for the service you provide. When our electorate officers and indeed ourselves reach the point with the service provider where we're just smashing our head against a literal, technological brick wall. So being able to refer constituents to your office is much appreciated. Let me just say that. With that, thank you very much for your time again and your evidence. We'll allow you to leave us and we'll proceed to take evidence from the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Even when there's three of us, we still manage to ask plenty of questions.
Yeah, no, there's a lot in it. Excellent. I welcome representatives from the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. Thank you for taking time to come and give evidence today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. I hope that's true. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
So Craig Latham, Deputy in the Office of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman.
And Alexandra Horton, Director of Advocacy in the Office of the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman.
Excellent. Thank you both. I now invite you to make a short opening statement. At the conclusion of your remarks, I'll invite members of the committee to ask questions.
So thank you, and thank you for this time to come before the committee today. So the role of our office is to advocate for small business and assist small business. So we do get to hear basically the problems with what's happening in the world, and I'll talk you through some of them here. But we not merely are the sort of voice into government around issues, but also assist on a one-to-one basis. So we've got a lot of that under our belt in this zone as well. So with small business and the NBN, the issues can be really split into three. One as the user, so a small business using the internet or the NBN, and the providers who can also be small businesses. So these can be the ISPs or IT service consultants. And also subcontractors.
Oh, you missed it. We just had the TIO Ombudsman put her back on and she got up and left and she had slippers on.
Yes, so the camera's still going.
Oh.
No.
I'm sorry to...
I'm very lucky to have...
That's just been caught on hand. That's just been caught on hand. So.
I'm very lucky to have won a seat today.
Sorry, Mr. Dr. Latham. It was too funny.
Also, there's the subcontractors who are involved in the rollout of the NBN as well, which you really shouldn't forget about. As I said, look, we get to see the bad bits of this, and so some of the problems that we see around small businesses using the internet, again, I'd split into three different sort of categories here. One is around the transition, so sometimes this is really painful. Getting the notification, seeing the notification amongst a whole lot of spam as well that you get. So these are like when you get your notices maybe through your letterbox, you're getting a whole lot of stuff that looks a whole lot like the NBN that isn't the NBN talking to you as well. And then all the technical problems. It can be problems around compatibility of equipment or just not working to start it up. Then you've got the plan issues as well. So this is around the pricing, having some of the plans quite expensive and then opting for, say, a residential plan rather than a commercial plan, and then, which may seem fine because you get the same, maybe the same speed, but you don't get the same support. And then realising it when you really need it, that you aren't in the right spot. Unsuitability of plans too, being oversold, so getting plans that are far out exceed, sometimes not exceed, but far out exceed what you actually really need to conduct the business, so you're paying additional amounts that you don't need to. And then there's the service issues, the dropouts, when there's a problem, the time to rectify as well. So that's the small business users. The small business providers, so there's the ISP, IT consultants. So they tend to get caught between the NBN and the client, with people blaming each other as to what the actual problem is. And also their ability to access some of the plans that the bigger on-providers of plans get. Again, so access to sort of value and a range of plans that they can then sell to small businesses to use as well. Then there's the small business subcontractors. So these are the ones that are subcontracted to help roll out. Things happening here that we get to hear about are slow payment of these people for the job done, and then retention payments too as well, which can be particularly nasty for cash flow. Broad issues, coverage, so these are just thinking more generally about NBN, just the coverage across Australia, the speed, the promised speed, the actual speed, and then the comparable opportunities between urban and regional settings as well. And I throw in amongst the broad issues here, which is something that I'm personally concerned with as well, is disaster redundancy. So being caught up in bushfires with electricity going off, ability now that we've gone fully sort of and reliant on electricity, how to get messages out there when bad things happen, when telecommunications become overwhelmed. So there's a few things in that space as well I think we could talk about.
Excellent, thank you for that. So just explanation from me in terms of how we'll conduct this. Obviously the committee is made up of members across the political spectrum. There are members from the Coalition, there are members from the Australian Labor Party and members from the independent minor parties. So as to be fair, we compartmentalise time, so I'm going to allow Ms Templeman to begin, 20 minutes, and then Dr Haynes or Dr Haynes?
Begin, actually, Chair.
Not really.
No?
I like going last. Something about my style. Perhaps we'll start with Dr Haynes then, and then we'll move to Ms Templeman, and we'll round out with me, and that will give us a little bit of time in the end if we need it. I have a sneaking suspicion we might not need you for the full 90 minutes. Dr Haynes.
But we have every single hearing.
Said that, and we've always managed to use all the time. So.
Thank you very much, Dr Latham and Ms Horden, for making witness to us today. Can I clarify, please, that you investigate complaints beyond telecommunications and NBN?
Yes.
So it's just one component of what
this
you...
is one small thing
Yes.
of all the complaints that we deal with.
Yes.
Yes.
Would you be able to give me some indication of what proportion of the complaints that you deal with do relate to NBN telecommunications more broadly?
It'd be hard. We deal with, I think at the moment we're sitting at about something like about 7,000 disputes, or people contacting us for disputes a year. Now, NBN is only going to be a small proportion of those, but the spread is so huge across what we do. So that we administer the dispute resolution under a variety of industry codes, like the Dairy Code, the Franchising, Horticulture and Oil codes. So that takes up a lot. We're the small business tax concierge as well. So these are problems, which we're seeing a few at the moment, with tax issues when the Commissioner makes a decision and gives you a notice of assessment, and then you want to appeal it to the AAT. So that's, again, another large thing. But then there's all the normal, in quotes, contract disputes as well. So that'd be the bulk of what we do. Some of them are in this space. Some deal with the NBN, but there's other telecommunications issues as well. So I was just reflecting on all the telecommunications things we've had over time, and remembering one about a pit. So being charged, I think it was something like $30,000 to dig a hole, and then the responsibility of the small business or not the small business for this hole that's being dug or dug. It can come up in a whole range of things. But so in terms of our overall thing, this will be just a sliver of all those issues. But we see a lot of problems, a lot of things.
So willing to proffer a percentage on a lot?
Well, it's made up, but it might... telecommunications in a year, it's going to be below 100. So,
Okay.
but I don't know how much of that it would be. But it's not a constant thing. But I could say, if I was calling out issues that come before us, this would be telecommunications in general would be one of the issues that you do get issues with, and spikes as well. So way back in the beginning of the rollout, we would have had a spike there. But you have problems like even around things like telephone numbers. I've got a current one, but there's older ones that deal with when you give up a telephone number and not being able to get it back, that sort of issue. We deal with that too.
Okay.
Now, our office doesn't duplicate other services, so that if it's something that the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman would pick up, then we would put it there, and if it's not resolved, we may pick it up again. But we don't duplicate other services as well. So of that 7,000, we handle quite a number in-house, but we get people to the right spot.
That was actually my next question, your relationship with TIO. So relevant ones you would refer across. And would you have any sense of how often they're resolved then when they go across to the TIO?
Yeah, it will depend on the sort of issue, and offhand, there's some issues that the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman won't take as well. They fall outside their scope. We sometimes hear back, so that's sort of the gauge, because we will always, when we give somebody a referral, we'll say, now, if you have a problem, come back to us, and we'll seek to fix that problem either with that person or take it back on. Occasionally we get things coming back, but it's more on the occasion than the rule. So.
You mentioned that you do some work and you make comparable you make comparisons between urban and rural and regional investigations. Would you be able to comment on that a bit more in relation to NBN?
Yeah, so I did hear one of the last witnesses talk about having more city than country, and I was thinking my gut feel around this one as well is I think we get to see a little bit more country than city. So that was interesting. Obviously, the volume of problem is going to be concentrated in the city because there's just more of people using it there. But certainly we do get quite a range of outer city people, and maybe it's partly because the frustration of not being able to get it resolved in a timely way. Because again, as I said before, we get to see the stuff that's not going well. People don't ring up to tell us how brilliant life is. And so when they get frustrated, that's when they'll reach out to us. So they've normally tried a few avenues and then they can't get it resolved. So then we step in to help. So.
And have you...
Please. I could just add to that. I think the complaints that we get from rural and regional areas probably stick with us a bit more because they seem a little bit more ridiculous, perhaps. So, for example, a small business that ran a dress shop that would have to go out into the street and hold the FPOS machine up in the sky to get connectivity to process a transaction. Yes. That's the kind of stuff that, I mean, if that happened to me when I was buying a frock, I'd be thinking to myself, what is going on here? And so those kind of complaints really stick with us because it's not just the line went down to a suburb, it's a business is operating for 3 months, having to walk out into the street every time they're processing a transaction. So they're more impactful in some ways.
And that's not an isolated example because again...
No, I know it's not. I've been to shops such as this.
All three of us are from regional Australia.
That's right.
You'd experience it.
Don't move the FPOS machine, they say, because if you move it to there, it doesn't work.
So would you be able to give me some sense then of the impact that actually has on that small business in terms of their capacity to trade?
Look, it's quite a significant impact, I have to say. Small business people, as you would know, living in regional areas, have really strong relationships with their customers and having to go through a bit of a rigmarole just to process a payment, coming into work and not being unsure whether or not your connectivity is going to work today, and even trying to digitise in some ways. I know there are a lot of fantastic businesses in the regions that would do a roaring trade online, but being unsure day to day how their connectivity is going to go, it has a huge impact on the bottom line of the business, of course, but also the sense of confidence of those business owners that they're able to get up, they know that things are going to work and they're going to be able to do their work without having to call their provider and say, look, the internet's down again, I don't know what to do about this, or I can't get my FPOS machine to work. So it's the confidence that the tools they need will be available, the ones that they've paid for will be available when they need them. That's a really big issue for them.
So given that and given the situation we find ourselves in and small businesses having to adapt and pivot to so much more digital sales, what impact would you say that these problems would have on, again, rural and regional businesses who are attempting to do that?
Well, I think we've seen a bit of coverage of the difficulty that people did have transitioning to working from home, and that's probably given people working from home in the cities a bit of a taste of what it's like trying to operate in the regions as an everyday occurrence. And when bandwidth slows down, when things get caught up, it just makes it harder and harder for those regional businesses to pivot. And it's hard enough for them to pivot because they don't have a main street that people are flocking up and down all the time. So it just adds an extra layer of difficulty to them. Yeah.
And do you, as part of your role, do you attempt to calculate the cost of that?
We don't do modelling on that, no.
In terms of where you go with those kind of complaints and what kind of recommendations you make, would you be able to just tell us about your reporting and how recommendations you would make for improvements around that? Where does that go and what satisfaction you get in recommendations being acted on?
So we've done a few submissions on this topic, and so I'll just go to my notes on this one. One submission was an ACMA consultation on consumer information and service continuity, so the sorts of things we would have raised there about the difficulty of SMEs to compare plans and things like that. Negotiation around, inability to negotiate around service contracts, and just the migration to the network in general being of difficulty. So then we also submitted to inquiry into the business case for the NBN and the experience of small business in Parliament, and again spoke about reliability of the importance of reliability of NBN services, the problems around service interruption and who is the right person, and people blaming each other rather than potentially both taking responsibility and acting together. Affordable NBN, those sorts of things. So we will submit into various processes. We also conduct our own reviews of things. We haven't done one on the NBN, although it's obviously a factor in much of what we look at, the use of electronic methodology, reg tech. There's so much that's based back into this, even debanking refusal of service of electronic service, banking services and things as well. So this is quite a player across a whole range of things that we do.
Would you see this as a review that you would undertake now, particularly given the amount of dependence small businesses currently have on digital services?
So it's certainly a critical issue, and I wouldn't want to commit to one here because it is, as I said, a part of a lot of what we do. So when we look and choose areas to zone in on, it is the importance of the area, but it's where we can actually influence a change, how we can do that. So if there were bits here that were being missed, then we would look at either a review or something else, because it doesn't have to be an inquiry, review, hearing or anything. It can be as simple as going to people who have the ability, like ACMA or whoever, to influence a change and making that case for small business there.
And do you feel that you have sufficient powers and resources to enable that kind of influence?
Yes. Yeah. So now our powers under our legislation are quite strong. So we can demand information, and that's one of the most powerful things there, so that we can require people to provide us with the information that we ask for. When there's a dispute, the Ombudsman will recommend an approach to resolve it, whether it's mediation or conciliation, whatever it is. And then if a party refuses to engage in that, we can call that out too. And we haven't had to do that very many times because of the impact that could have on people. They're willing, and people are, and this is small business, big businesses, and government are adopting alternative dispute resolution as well, which is another thing that actually really now relies on NBN, because dispute resolution now pretty much is not being done in person. It's being done when it's that alternative dispute resolution mediation. It's being done through electronic channels. And why in the past we always said, look, it's really good to be in the same room is because you can gauge people, you can see the nuance. And that's where you really want a good service as well, because now you're stuck on a screen. To get that sort of non-verbal feedback is really important.
You mentioned before cost and complaints that you have in regard to variations, I presume, in service models and cost of those service models across RSPs. Are you able to just speak a little bit more broadly to that and what you see in the complaints and how you resolve issues of disputes around quoted costs and actual delivery of service?
So with this one, it's some of it is just being able to get clarity of what I'm buying. So it's the same sort of thing that you deal with like an insurance contract or whatever. What is the thing that I'm buying here? They're standard form contracts, so you don't, as a rule, get to negotiate things. You can add bits in or maybe take things out, but some of it's right up front around clarity of what I'm doing, and then it becomes, when there is a problem, the contract, which you probably haven't read in detail, it's probably 20 pages long in fine print, will give you service standards of which they may be complied with and numbers will not be, but they may not be consistent with what your business needs. Because like a minute down is profit loss, it's stress on the small business owner. And again, that's where we will come into act as quickly as we can to get services up and running, to talk to the people who can actually influence it, or get people very quickly to the TIO if it's one of the disputes that they'll handle.
We've heard a couple of times throughout this inquiry around businesses not always purchasing the plan that's appropriate for a business. In fact, purchasing plans that are more suitable for a domestic situation. Are you able to comment on that?
Well, a lot of that will come to the pricing structures as well, and this is a long-standing complaint. Just because I'm a business, if I'm getting the same service, why am I having to pay extra for this service? So some of that may well be that the service standard is better. Obviously up front, with all the promises of how brilliant your world will be, you're probably not as focused on it turning bad, and turning bad potentially really quickly. So the moment it connects, cutting you off, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of small businesses, because cost pressures are so heavy on them, they will just choose the cheapest plan they think they can get away with. And then I know you've had some feedback from Aussie Broadband that they see that particularly starkly in the rural and regional areas. And what should be a business account is usually a residential account, so then the technical fixes don't happen as quickly, and that obviously has significant impacts on the business. Much like many things, until you need it, you probably don't think you need it. Like health insurance, it's one of those things that until you've broken your leg, you kind of go, oh, it's just an extra bit of money out the door. So I think one of the key themes that we often talk about is the need for absolute transparency when dealing with small businesses. And so for those larger businesses to make a really concerted effort to be transparent from the outset and say to them, look, you can choose to go onto this residential plan, but if you do, know that our turnaround time for technical fixes may be up to 3 days. So to be very clear, you will be without service potentially for 3 days. If you choose to go with the small business plan, it will be a 24-hour service standard. Having that all up front and very, very clear for those small businesses will allow them to make a much more informed decision. I can't guarantee it will mean that they'll choose the small business option, but at least they'll have had that option up front and clearly explained to them.
In addition there as well, because when they say 3 days, you may well get the wink on, we're normally a lot faster than this, but to give people actual times. So it's 3 days, up to 3 days, and normally it takes 52 hours or something to call it out. So there's a few things that when you're entering a plan that would be critical to you. So it's the cost of it, it's the time at which I'm locking in, it's the speed and the actual speed, and then it's the backup I think they would be some of the critical factors. There may be more, but cost of getting out as well would be another thing, I think.
And perhaps the level of service. I mean, we know that a significant number of small businesses in this country are started by new Australians, migrants to Australia, and they may not necessarily fully understand navigating these complex systems that we operate on. Often English might be their third or fourth language, so that, you know, they're perfectly competent, but a lot of the technical language may be quite confusing. So ensuring that all of that's explained appropriately up front, that the service standard for these people is appropriate, is important.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks, Ms Horton. Thanks, Dr Latham. That's all I have, Chair.
Over to you, Ms Temple.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And clearly you both have a passion for helping small businesses. I can see that coming through. So I'm not sure if you were in the room when I described a scenario of a small business having an NBN issue, because what I'm curious to understand is when you stay engaged to resolve the issue and when it goes to NBN, when it goes to TIO, I should say. So in the scenario I described, I'm running my business from home, my internet goes, something happens, it's gone, and the RSP is trying to get me to talk on a mobile phone, but of course, because I don't have mobile phone reception within my house, there's many in the Blue Mountains and Hawkesbury and my electorate and all over the country don't. I have to leave my house in order to even make that mobile phone call. It's compounded by the fact that in bushfire areas, a lot of us who have homes built to flame zone standards have especially thick walls, so less signal is permeating them. This is going to become more and more an issue. So I'm running my business, NBN goes down, I'm up on the street saying, look, I've got a problem. They say, okay, well, let's go through a few things. I go, well, no, I can't unless I write them down, run inside, come back out, tell you how I went. The logistics of it are hard. Now, I come to you and go, help, my business is crippled, I'm really struggling to get the help I need. They're not being compliant I'm saying I need someone to come out, that's not happening. I come to you, what happens when you get it? Does it stay with you? Does it get flicked off? How does that work?
So with something like that, we would think, right, because our legislation says if somebody else is set up, convenient and effective to deal with it, we get it to them. So that would be where maybe in that dispute we'd pick up the phone, talk to the TIO and ask, is this something, what would you likely do? Okay, so are you willing to take this and able to deal with it speedily? So then if yes, we can shoot it off. If it's no, then what we do is we keep it in-house, and we would, in that sort of situation, immediately be getting on to people who can help, which may be the same person that person has spoken to. But in that sort of dispute, my angle might be to say, look, given the nature of it, we need to get you out there quickly and in person. And so that might be the way that you'd go. We'd work with the business to say, right, what have you tried? What have they told you? What have you tried? Have you done all these things? If no, then yeah, do those things, see if you can get it up. But then when you hit that problem and it's critical, we would then see, okay, what levers can we pull to get somebody in to help you fast?
And in terms of seeing that scenario replicated throughout a geographic area or throughout a sector, you've also got an advocacy role. At what point do you identify those sorts of trends and say, look, there's clearly a problem here that needs a bigger solution?
So we can see them, and it hasn't happened, well, it happened a little bit in the early days of the NBN, and we did a lot of work in those early days. But it can happen now fairly quickly because we've been in operation now since 2015, getting old, or 2016. And so we can normally spot it because we see the tip of the iceberg when people come, and we can start to spot that looks a bit weird, right? So always there's two sides to a story, so that and the truth often is in the third side, right? So but we can start to spot, okay, we've gotten sometimes now even on one, but normally when you get a couple, you think, oh, that's interesting, and in quick succession you think, something's happening, and then we can reach out and actually start to ask some questions of people, contacts, to see is this something a bit broader that we're starting to see, or is it just a little coincidence that we've gotten a couple of these at the same time.
So where that leads me to is you mentioned disaster redundancy. And I think, like you, we see the tip of the iceberg, but sometimes it is a really big iceberg. And what I'm certainly seeing in my electorate, which is very bushfire prone, flood prone, storm prone, is that there is no capacity for disaster redundancy for NBN services and therefore for businesses to run their business because of gaps in the mobile reception, and there's no other fallback that they have. Now, I'm seeing that trend as the NBN rollout continues and people lose their landlines, which was our backup.
Yes.
Are you seeing a similar... You mentioned disaster redundancy. Are you seeing similar things? And can you just talk me through your observations?
Well, this reminds me of an example I heard only just last weekend of, again, it was the rollout of the NBN. The business had been what I'll call spammed by all the people willing to provide services, of which NBN letters were one of those. They would have known way back when that, yes, NBN's in the zone, obviously, because of all this spam, but had missed the time when the phone was going to be chopped off. And so they actually hit that time and wondering, oh, the phone's not ringing today, that's a little bit weird. We're not getting things through our normal booking processes and things. And that's when it dawned, something's gone wrong. So speak to your ISP, and the ISP says, oh, no, the NBN's switched you off. It's, your landline's gone. And so I know in that particular situation, the ISP responded really well for them and got them up and running with alternative means, so Wi-Fi sort of means and mobile reception. But again, that one point is again regional, and there was no fallback other than sort of the mobile thing. And I think they were lucky to get it up, because there's other cases, especially in the early days, where businesses have been caught in loops for quite a period.
So what do you see as the disaster redundancy measures for small businesses that are heavily reliant on NBN and have no mobile reception?
Yeah, I think, and look, I'm not the technical person. However, in my mind, the way you would start to deal with this is around the mobile coverage and the ability of banks and others to provide alternatives very quickly. Because like a business is not going to want or be able to invest in multiple redundancy satellite phones and things, and it doesn't make sense. But the people it makes sense to are those, although the last season was a horrific season where it was happening all across multiple states. But normally these things are a bit more localised and have mechanisms to be able to get in mobile towers to get people up and running, get them switched into systems that will work inside that network. What worries me, and it's not so much for this committee, is things like bushfires and AM radio, the importance of that, and how that will probably disappear. And if you've got a car that's got the batteries, as I understand it, you don't get AM radio because the batteries interfere with your AM radio. So what does that person do? And so we are switching into this brilliant modern age that does all these great things, but when, again, that disaster and unanticipated sort of magnitude of disaster happens, what can you do quickly? And some of it is business continuity, but some of this is survival as well. First thing when fire's coming is what do I take from my business? How do I get out? How do I get my client records? How do I just strip this and go? Now, some of the NBN is fantastic. Cloud services can be fantastic around that if you've got electricity to be able to get them.
And so, that electricity issue comes up. People say, oh, I need communication and my NBN's down because the electricity is down. Although even if they've got mobile, the small business is using mobile reception and the battery has run down. Are they things that you have, on behalf of small businesses, raised and discussed with relevant other relevant agencies and departments about how much of an issue it can be?
To a limited extent. So we haven't had specific complaints come through about that I'm aware of. There may have been one or two over the bushfire season.
The bushfires, I think, that was when this. Well, certainly I've
When
been
it all
worried
kicked
about
off.
this because I was caught up in it as well.
Yeah.
And so my concern peaked when, oh, yes, I've got AM radio. How the hell do you do this without this? Yeah. And so I think that's percolated through some of the things that when we've responded around the bushfires, the need for that additional infrastructure / redundancy to deal with this.
So we have communicated that in submissions around other. Not specifically around NBN, for example, but around bushfire recovery and disaster planning. We've communicated those needs, but we haven't done a unique piece of work on that.
And solutions here potentially don't sit inside NBN, so it's a more interesting problem than just...
They get caught up in it as opposed to it being their issue. How many of the complaints you get from small business are not about how the NBN is working, but the fact that they don't have NBN yet?
Not sure that we have many of those.
Yeah, not now so much. Back in the day, when this was first coming out, people were wanting it to come quickly,
right.
and we do know some regions have still got issues, as you know, around communication. Even you've got NBN for that matter, but expecting NBN to resolve a whole lot of issues as well. Interestingly, the experience with NBN, personal and otherwise, is that you anecdotally seem to have many more dropouts than what you used to have as well, which I find curious in this system as well.
So just this morning, I got an email from a small business that employs 5 staff, and they're one of 20 businesses in a suburb that don't have NBN yet, and they were promised it in 2017. In 2017, May 2017, someone, they weren't sure if they were an NBN or a Telstra person, visited to get them ready for NBN because it was about to come. It hasn't. Is that, how would that complaint, so that's a bunch of small businesses operating, either one of them coming to you or coming to you as a group?
That would likely be one of ours, because I think that would be probably of a category, like we'd still want to speak to the telecommunications industry ombudsman, but I think that's probably of a category that's likely to be a bit more sticky with us. And so that's the sort of one where we would seek to get explanation and reach out and see, okay, well, how do we actually get this moving? So you've made promises, why haven't you followed through? So.
Yeah. Well, that one might come your way.
I'd be very happy to take that one on.
Thank you. How long have I got, Chair? A couple
How long
more
is a
minutes.
piece
Have I got a
of string?
few
No,
more
not
minutes?
really. I'm not doing it. Yeah, well, another 10 or 15.
So the flowing on from that, I guess I'm trying to picture the issues that you don't pass to the TIO. So these bigger systemic sort of ones, by the sound of it, where it's other influences, not purely the technology as such.
Yes.
What other, given that we're interested in small businesses and their use of NBN, what other small business / NBN issues, the customer might think it's an NBN issue. Is there anything else that you could identify that would be yours that you wouldn't sort of flick to the TIO as the responsible?
I would think issues where small businesses have done work on the network for the NBN and are perhaps having difficulty getting paid. So payment disputes, that's definitely well within our remit. Contractual disputes are also well within our remit, and because they don't have to do with the technology per se, we would hang on to those usually and try and deal with those. Retention payments as well, trying to negotiate release of retention payments would again fall well within our remit and be something we would look after. Issues where perhaps a small business is struggling to find where to go. They're not quite sure. Often with small business, they call up saying they've got a, they can't get a bill paid, but actually it's a contractual dispute or whatever it is. They're often not focused on the root cause of the dispute. I suppose they just want to get paid, which, that makes sense. Or they just want the internet to work and they're kind of going to one place when they ought to be going to another place. Those are the kinds of things that we would hang on to. And then, of course, if we do get a cluster, as you've been talking about, we may look at that as an advocacy issue potentially, if there's enough there.
So sorry, did you
So I was just going to say, going back to the
related?
sort of the three categories I started with, the
Yes.
small business users, when you're getting sort of the service issues and technical issues, that I would think would be the TIO. Alexandra has mentioned the subcontractor sort of issues, but there's also the providers in the middle as well. So this is when people are blaming each other, it's that sort of thing, or access to plans, that sort of thing as well. So it's more those latter categories are the ones that are more likely to be advocacy or / assistance.
So could you talk me through the retention payments issue, how that comes to you and the sorts of resolutions that you're able to secure?
Sure. So that's often when a small subcontractor is doing work, often for a mid-tier contractor. So there'll be obviously NBN, the prime contractor, and then a whole range of contractors beneath. Particularly in rural and regional areas, but in the cities as well, they often have to subcontract to perhaps a small electrician, a one-man band or one-woman band, who is having to lay the cabling or something like that for them. Now the mid-tier contractors have been known to hold retention payments. So say the job is $10,000, they might hold back $3,000 just in case they don't deem the job's been done well. And then that small business needs to negotiate for a release of the balance of their pay for having done the work. Now, mid-tier contractors and prime contractors, for them $3,000, to use the fictionalised example, is not a lot of money, but for a small business, it's a lot of money. And if they've done one job, they've spent a fortnight doing the job, and then to get a third of their pay not through, and it can often be for 2, 3, 4 months. That's really quite distressing for a number of those businesses. And so when those problems come to us, we would usually, through our assistance function, see if we can speak to the parties, see if they can come to an agreement. Otherwise, we've got a mediation function that we try and get them to resolve disputes that way.
And in terms of resolutions, how long typically do you look at the length of time it takes to resolve those and how satisfactory the resolution is for both parties?
So we always try for as quick a resolution as you can possibly get. Some of the, I'm thinking about that pit one that I raised previously where people were blaming each other. They can take a little bit longer. Yeah. So if it's my mobile number's been taken sort of thing, then maybe that should be fairly quick to get in and hopefully resolve it really fast so that somebody else doesn't get the number and you can get up and running again. Contractual disputes will take longer. We will, as a rule, something will come in and we'll ask to flesh it out, what we get to work out, okay, so, because sometimes the dispute as it presents initially, you might find there's a little bit more to it from the person who comes to you, and then we'll summarise that and then go normally to the other side and say, look, this is what this person is saying. We're really wanting your views as to what that means and what it means to you and how you might resolve it. Now, a lot of our matters can resolve actually at that stage. So it's about the escalation, because we won't write necessarily to the person who's been dealing with the dispute on the other side. We'll go to the CEO or whoever up the chain in order to say, look, is this something your company wants to be known for? This is what's being said. What's your view of it? So it's not, claiming this is 100% right, but it's saying that we're just trying to grapple with what's happening here and trying to define down what those issues are. So that process allows us to then be able to say, right, if you haven't been able to resolve it yourselves, then what we can do is we'll do a notice of effectively a notice of dispute, so a recommendation, to go to, say, mediation. We've got a range of things we can use here as well around alternative dispute resolution. It can be a neutral evaluation, it can be a case appraisal, it can be conciliation, which is a harder edge sort of mediation. So it's a whole range of things we can choose, and sometimes we choose them in combination. But the benefit of us triaging it at the start is that we've defined down exactly, this is exactly what you've got to argue about, and 1, 2, 3, and anything else that's relevant, so we won't cut out things that might emerge as the mediation goes. But then that crystallises what the issue. Now, as part of that, even once we've issued the recommendation to attend mediation, we'll still encourage the parties to deal with each other and seek to resolve outside mediation, and that happens a lot. That they can resolve. And part of it is, I think part of it is that we've actually taken away all the aggravation and stuff. It's these 3 issues that are the contractual or other issues that you need to grapple with. And as soon as you see it on paper, okay, that's not as hard as I thought. And then where it's more intractable, you then move into a mediation. And it's very effective then, mediation, at working through those issues and actually getting resolution. So what we try always to do is keep people out of court, to get quick dispute resolution and not have small businesses end up as part of a court case.
Now, those disputes wouldn't directly involve NBN Co, but is there a feedback loop about their contractor that you kind of close, so NBN is aware of down the line disputes that occur?
We have pretty good relationships with NBN Co, and it's allowed our assistance team to resolve a number of disputes quite quickly. And yes, they do informally, occasionally formally provide feedback. Yeah.
And you provide feedback to NBN Co. So are they aware of the down the line disputes, or does that depend on the circumstances?
It depends on the circumstances, but in some instances, during conversations with the NBN Co team, our assistance team will say, "Oh, we're aware of this issue, and we've resolved it this way," or whatever it is, just to keep them in the loop. It's not really a formal system. But.
And remember that we're seeing normally just the tip of the iceberg, so that NBN Co can be informed by various means as well, not purely us. So,
yeah. Look, one of the things you mentioned earlier and talked about was the transparency in plans for small business and those sorts of things. Are there any other areas where transparency would be helpful around roles and responsibilities of parties? Or I guess it's just to that broader, taking that issue. You gave a number of examples about transparency in specific plans, but is there anything else around that?
To not answer that specific question, the joint accountability, right? So this is actually getting, I think, to the root cause, right? So, and it's that point about blaming each other. But so when a small business or other person complains, for all the relevant parties to not seek to say, don't talk to me, talk to them, to say, no wrong door, right? You've come to me, let me take this on, I'm going to work with NBN Co, and we together we're committed to resolving your issue. It's quite I think a different sort of approach to the normal contract. My responsibility is this is where it ends. But it's certainly the approach that our office would take. You can come to us with anything. We're not going to say, well, we're not that person. We're going to get you to the right person and make sure that works for you.
So that's about what your role is, but I suppose I'm interested in what could be changed in the NBN or the NBN process, because we do get so many complaints, which are the RSP saying it's not us, it's Telstra. NBN Co saying it's not us, it's Telstra, them saying it's So
clarity around a bit of that would be very useful for small businesses, so that if they call their RSP and they say, look, this is a matter for NBN Co, there's confidence that it actually is a matter for NBN Co. It's not just that stuff going on. So it's having it clear and making sure that the RSPs and NBN Co are prepared to be accountable for what are their issues, rather than say, oh, you know, we're going to punt you over here and then they're going to punt you over there. That would be really useful for small businesses.
Because some of it is not as simple as, I'm on the phone, okay, I can see your issue is with NBN Co or issue with me. It requires a little bit of diagnosis here as well. And so this is where my point about the joint accountability would come in. So it's not just purely the contract says go there, that sounds like that, just shunt you. But you've come to me, no wrong door, together we'll work to resolve this. And they can have the little fight
And
about what's going on, really.
And is it the RSPs you're suggesting who need to have that no wrong door policy?
Yeah,
That will, if either had them. So if either the RSP or NBN Co. So if you're a small business and you call your RSP and they say, look, this isn't our problem, it's 99% sure it's an NBN problem, but rather than you calling them, we'll call them and see if we can work that out. And equally, if you call NBN and say, look, the internet's down, and they say, look, it's probably your RSP, but why don't we give them a call and come back to you so that we actually know whose problem it is before we, send you on a wild goose chase. Insofar as that is possible with these organisations.
it does sound a lot like customer service.
It's odd that, isn't
customer
it?
service.
Yeah.
And, I mean, it feels like our office plays that role often. I suspect you feel like you play that role often. I suspect the TIO feels it plays that role often, and we are resourced at varying levels to do that. If you imagined a system that was the resourcing that would be required to do that, I suppose I'm curious what you think that would look like.
I suppose it would need to be a business decision for the RSPs and NBN Co, wouldn't it? I mean, exceptional customer service comes at a cost.
Except it may be in a more efficient approach.
It may be
rather
more
than
efficient.
shunting stuff backwards and forwards comes at a cost too. So I don't know.
So I suppose, and I guess that leads me to the question, is there a role for the NBN Co to play in as the rollout nears, gets nearer to a completion and their focus shifts? Do they have a role in and responsibility in ensuring that the whole thing works, as opposed to just walking away from it from that point on? What are your thoughts about that? In an ideal world, I suppose.
In a perfect world, that would be lovely.
All right, so we'll never say that I'm not generous with time because I think we're almost going into the fourth quarter. I just want to pick up this theme about roles and responsibilities. So it's effectively the retail service provider that has the contractual relationship with the customer. So it stands to reason, doesn't it, that they, we said before, the retail service provider and NBN. Well, the reality is retail service providers have to step up here. Because if you go and complain to the NBN has effectively no information about the nature of your agreement with the RSP. So when we say no wrong door, it's effectively the RSPs. What we really want, don't we, is the RSPs to say, if we think this is a network issue, we will take it up with NBN on your behalf. Is that fair?
That'd be fair.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right, so in terms of your submission, you talk about the NBN Solution Finder tool as a reasonably good initiative. And you go on to say along those similar lines that you believe it's something that that needs better education in order for people to determine which package they choose in terms of their RSP and these things. But then you talk about that NBN and RSP should be responsible jointly to raise education and literacy in this space. I'm going to suggest to you and just ask you to comment about this. It's really a role for the RSPs, isn't it? Isn't it the RSP's obligation to make sure the consumer understands the nature of the offering and is better positioned to make good decisions? Yeah, so and if it's not the RSP, it's a combination of RSP and government, I suppose. It's not the NBN Co's responsibility.
Yeah, and the education would, I'd frame as clarity as well. So it's not go off to school and learn stuff. It is about having very clear offerings that are understandable. And obviously that is that contractual relationship to get your service in place is with your RSP. So.
Understandable and comparable, easily comparable
Yes.
across RSPs, that's really critical, because if they use different terminology and set out their tables differently, it's hard to compare.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that, as with most things in this space, blame is quickly sheeted home to the NBN in circumstances where it's rarely either their fault in the case of a technical complaint or their responsibility in relation to the broader context. And I think you're right. Too often what we see, is this the experience of the Small Business Ombudsman? Too often what I hear anyway, and I'm wondering if you have the same experience, is, well, I've got I'm having a poor experience, and then when you scratch the surface a little bit, you find out that the plan is nowhere near what they need to meet their either business or personal needs. Do you come across that a bit?
Well, and it can be the reverse of that too. Your plan
Right, it's
is
far too generous.
It's just not the right plan for you.
Yeah. I suppose what I'm saying here is that responsibility for those discussions really rests with the RSPs. It's not for NBN to be involved in that space at all. About choosing the plan, informing consumer about the plan, understanding elements, providing an ability to compare like for like. It's just the RSP's first and last, isn't it?
Yeah, well, certainly about plans, yes. Dropouts might be a whole different matter. So
sure,
yeah.
But even with a dropout, the consumer has that experience. The consumer has a relationship with their retail service provider. The consumer complains to retail service provider. Retail service provider ought to accept the responsibility to go and talk to the wholesale service provider because they actually have that relationship.
Yeah.
The consumer doesn't.
And they can talk in the right language.
Well, that's right.
So,
And presumably they're also geared up to have these discussions because it's a nature. Okay. I just wanted to be on the same page there because I worry that often authorities, members of parliament, others kind of look to the NBN to be all things to all people, but in that space they just simply don't have the relationship. In Kate's letter or effectively submission to us of January, there was a reference to there needing to be greater transparency for planned and unplanned outages. I'll just read it to you. There should be greater transparency, detailed reporting and communication of any planned and unplanned outages. I just want to clarify, I accept that as it relates to planned outages. I think it's probably a little bit much to ask NBN Co to be transparent and communicate in advance in relation to unplanned outages. I mean, bushfires, floods, these things, by their very nature, they're unplanned.
Yeah. Preemptive communication around unplanned outages, obviously difficult.
Yes.
Yes, complicated. But
I would have thought so.
Yeah. But once an outage occurs, communicating effectively and saying, look, this will be, we think the fix will take 6 hours, as opposed to we have no idea when the fix will be in place. We can't give you any information. We have no idea what's caused it. Even being able to say, it's often quite comforting to for businesses to hear, look, there's been something's happened, a tree's come down, it's gone through your line, it will take us about 6 hours to fix, we think, and give them an outside time, and communicating transparently around that would be really important.
I accept post unplanned outage. There's an obligation to get that communication piece right. But I think it's also complicated and made more difficult by the very nature of the fact that the systems we use to communicate are down. That's the nature of the problem. So I presume it's about being quite novel in this space and using perhaps older technology, radio and media services to get that news out. But I think there is a problem. Namely, we rely so heavily, and I think, Dr. Latham, you were referring to it, we rely so heavily on these new forms of communication that when we need to communicate with consumers about them being unavailable, we're stuck in a bit of a conundrum, aren't we?
Yeah, and that's when you get the message, oh, please log on to the service to seek to lodge a problem or to...
Correct.
Yes.
I know others had this experience, but I certainly had it very frustrating during the recent bushfire season, where, in particular, resale service providers were telling constituents of mine who'd lost their homes and copper networks had all been melted to just jump online and log a complaint. Equally, I was getting retail service providers that were suggesting to me that nobody had complained. And it was hard for them to comprehend that nobody had complained because they had no means to complain. Like it was, so I feel your frustration. I've only got a couple more questions, so I'm going to make good on our promise to get you out of here before the full 90 minutes is up. Oh, well, maybe not. I'll make good on my part of it. I just want to talk now prospectively about a couple of things that NBN's engaged in and what your views are. So NBN Co has recently announced a $700 million initiative to deliver a zero upfront business grade fibre connections to 90% of all business locations. I'm just wondering if your office is aware of that initiative at all?
Yeah, no, we're aware of a number of initiatives of
Yeah.
improved infrastructure, yes.
Yeah. Okay. And the last one deals with the enterprise business market. So this is a market that's traditionally been dominated by one major market player. We've obviously moved to create competition in that space. Now, I'd like you to comment on whether you think NBN's entry into that market is a good thing for small and medium businesses, and in particular, whether that competition and its downward pressure on prices is something that is being well received by small businesses.
So
Small and medium businesses, I should say.
Certainly, more players generally will mean better competition.
Generally.
I think we'd be very supportive of the opening up and having it as a level playing field, so that because I know small business providers themselves have complained about the volume discounts and things that others may be able to get hold of. As to whether, and this might be a Productivity Commission or an ACCC thing, about whether NBN Co playing in that would increase or decrease competition.
Seems self-evident to me that if NBN Co are facilitating effectively other entrants into the market, that it has to drive up competition. What it does to prices, economic theory would tell us it would come down, but that's to be seen, I think. There are certain examples where I can point to where there have been significant reductions, but we have a bit more time to work that out, I think. Last question from me. It deals with the recent CVC uplift of 40% that was provided. I asked some questions about the TEO. It's probably more appropriately directed to them, but I'd just also ask you, have you seen a reduction in complaints from small and medium businesses around the quality of their service while that uplift was taking place to take account of COVID-19? Yeah,
I think even before then, the complaints around services, the quality of service had diminished.
Oh, right.
So
this is before COVID,
this
before
is
the
even
pandemic?
before,
Right,
I think,
okay.
yeah. So obviously initially with the greater use of the internet straight up, there was maybe some teething issues around that, but we're certainly not of late getting a whole lot of my service is not working sort of complaints.
Right. Okay. Well, back to you. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And we'll round out there.
I'm just flowing through on the greater transparency roles and responsibilities stuff. So I absolutely see the not everyone's, you can't expect NBN Co to be responsible for a whole lot of things. But what are the things that, from addressing complaints, that there needs to be confidence that they're taking full responsibility for in resolving those complaints?
So one of the key ones is for them to have proper visibility down their chain, where the subcontractors are working maybe through middle tier people. Because they're going to be one of the most effective routes to actually ensure that people are getting paid properly and on time.
So that's on paying contractors, but I'm talking about in resolving if small business has an internet outage, they go to their RSP. What should RSPs expect from NBN Co in terms of assisting them to get a resolution on their customer's dispute?
So I think if the service is down, an RSP would reasonably expect that NBN Co would help get the service back up. If it's an NBN problem, ultimately, I mean, I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. And to be able to get the right information from the NBN Co about what has caused the outage, how long it's going to take to fix, and then to be able to feed that back to the small business customer would be useful for the RSPs, I imagine.
And my experience is that the customer tells me that this is what the RSP says NBN Co has told them. Mm-hmm. We then go in a different way to NBN Co and get a completely different explanation for it. So it does seem that communication between the RSP and NBN Co has some flaws in it currently, from my experience, and what you're saying suggests that has to be very transparent communication, and that's the issue that you're identifying there.
Well, it seems to be from the RSP's perspective, if they're not getting transparent communication from the wholesaler, I mean, the NBN Co probably feels that they're giving the necessary information to the RSP. If the RSP is not communicating that effectively to the small business or the consumer, then that's a problem for the RSP in terms of their translation of the correct information. And with many of these things, the middle seller has a call centre with a script that they go through, and that script may often not be particularly helpful. Sometimes it's important for them to say, okay, the script tells me to do this, but actually what the customer's asking me for is different, and I need to get these answers for them. So the RSPs being flexible enough to provide the information that they need to provide is a key element of that.
And in your experience in resolving these complaints, given that some of them may not go through, some of these things might be dealt with by the TIO, not you, are you confident that currently the information going from NBN Co to an RSP is transparent and accurate information getting?
I'm not sure that we have any visibility or sufficient visibility to comment. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, colleagues. Well, that concludes today's proceedings. I want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Latham and Ms. Hordern for their evidence today. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Hansard, as always, and Secretariat for their assistance. Thank you all again, and I declare this hearing adjourned. Thanks. 12 o'clock for our